clock there for the preacher to see. So you got out in time. And if you didn't have one, you put one in. So get started here with the slides. There we go. So this is what I've been working on, I guess, most of my career, oil and U.S. foreign policy. I came to Chapel Hill in 1973, just in time for the oil crisis. And said, this could be actually a good topic to do a dissertation on. And it took a while, but I finally got into it. So let's have the first one. Right, this is sort of a summary of the whole talk. I could just do this and we could stop. But what I wanted to talk about, one of the things that you have to know about oil geography, there's only two great powers that have oil, the US and Russia, Soviet Union. All the other powerful countries didn't have much oil. Britain got its start on coal. But the U.S., so this makes the U.S. exceptional. And the U.S. is also exceptional. It is the leading producer again. It was the leading oil producer throughout most of the 20th century. It is now again. It's also the leading oil consumer. So, when prices go up, that's bad for consumers, but it's good for the U.S. producers. And when prices go down, that's bad for the producers. It's good for the consumers. So it's a win-win in that sense. So really, the U.S., it's no surprise. I mean, oil is only one of the many resources. U.S. is a continental-sized country, or most of North America, not all of North America, but a good bit of it. So that's it. This is, you hear a lot about American exceptionalism. Oil is one part. Oil and energy is one part of American exceptionalism. So one of the key factors in oil and U.S. foreign policy has been a desire to control access to oil. Now, for the first part of the century, first half really, the U.S. is no problem. We had enough oil for ourselves and we could export. But people were concerned about running out of oil. And U.S. oil companies, especially Standard Oil of New Jersey, does that ring any bells? Today's Exxon, well, they got broken up by antitrust in 1911. They lost all their producing. So they were looking for oil overseas, a lot of other companies. So, it's not only oil for the U.S. as a country, it's also oil for U.S. oil companies. And the leading oil companies at the time, known as the Seven Sisters, I'll have a logo for them. 5 of the 7 sisters were U.S. companies. Standard Oil of New Jersey, now Exxon. Standard Oil of New York, CECONY, Mobil, now taken over by Exxon. Standard Oil of California, SoCal, now Chevron. Wait, Standard Oil, okay. The Texas company, then Texaco, which has now been taken over by Chevron. And Gulf, anybody remember Gulf? They got taken over by Chevron. The other two, anybody ideas who the other two? BP was known first as Anglo-Persian, then Anglo-Iranian, and then British Petroleum, and then Shell. Shell is the other. Shell is, throughout most of the first half of the 20th century, the big rivalry was Shell and Standard Oil and Exxon. And they still dislike each other. I was on a flight once with a couple of Shell employees, and they said, the trouble with Exxon is they're not oilmen, they're bankers. Shell is much better in the technical side, but there's also a little bit of envy there because, Standard Oil is good at making money. And I guess that's what the business, but it's basically an investment bank. They've had a really bad run of never finding oil themselves, but they have money, so they buy fields after somebody else has found them, is pretty much what they've done. Control of oil has been a key to U.S. foreign policy from, I would say, World War I to now. And that's, promoting domestic production and promoting access to foreign fields. It used to be access was through concessions. You know, you get a concession to produce oil somewhere because in most of the world, the government owns subsoil rights. Not in the US, but in most of the world. Concession doesn't give you ownership of that oil. It gives you the right to produce it. Now, most of the foreign oil is owned by state-owned oil companies, you know, government, but companies still do quite well. Record profits. US, there's just some quick statistics. US leading oil producer, 66% of world oil in 1920. 1945, still 66. You can see it beginning to go down. By 1970, 73, it's down to about 20%. 2000 down to 10.4. It really goes down till about 2008. And then that's when shale oil production kicks in. And now the US is the leading producer in the world. Again, it's also the leading consumer. US converted to an oil-based economy in the first half of the 20th century, the rest of the world in the second half. US, besides being dominant in oil, also has a lot of coal, a lot of natural gas. So, you know, energy has not been a problem in that sense. Control of oil helped the US prevail in great power competition, i.e. World War I, World War II especially. US provides 80% of the oil for the Allies in both World War I and World War II. And I'll get to that, why that's so important. It helps control great power composition. And, you know, it's good for allies. Most of the time, the oil that the US has produces, especially in the Middle East, is not for the US market. It's for the markets of its allies in Western Europe and in Asia. We didn't need it. And then when we did need oil, where do you think we got it? Venezuela, Canada, and earlier Mexico. So this gets the US very involved in politics and oil producing countries, Mexico, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, especially in the Middle East after the 1920s. So when you talk about oil and US foreign policy, you talk about government policy, but you also have to talk about the companies. So it's, you know, it's tricky. Are you talking about companies or countries? And they overlap a lot. So you really have to look at the capabilities and interests of private oil companies. And then you have to study how do the oil companies exercise their influence. And that gets you into a study of private power and public policy in a capitalist democracy. So this is why I like oil, because it gets you involved in so many different things, not just foreign policy, also domestic policy. You might even do a little geology. I did rocks for jocks when I was in college. The teacher was an ex-geologist for, those days it was Esso. He didn't find much oil, so he was teaching. But when we went on field trips, he was always looking for, you know, what they call surface indications that there may be oil. He never found him. Next. I'm a historian, but a historian of energy, the oil industry, US foreign policy. And I think history is the way you really should go about this, because when you study history, it gives you a wider range of reference. You know, we can't all travel everywhere and go everywhere. You can read about how other people in other places and other times lived and died. It gives you a wider range of experience. It's not just about the past. You know, in the US, people say, oh, that's history. In other words, it doesn't matter. History matters. History is always with you. It's a key to understanding the present and preparing for the future. It doesn't mean the future is going to be like the past, only slightly different. But if you don't know what happened in the past, one of my teachers at North Carolina, who died a few years ago, said, you know, it's like being caught out in a ship in the middle of the ocean. You can't see where you came from, and you can't see where you're going. You're lost. And so you have to really, you know, think about that. History is about context, about time and place. What thing, always drives me crazy. And I used to tell my students when they would write something, I said, history happened in chronological order. You, you know, that's your default option. You can't have something happen in the 1960s, cause something that happened in the 1940s. Doesn't work that way. And where it happens is important. Like I said, the US has oil in the US. That's important. That's geography. That's geology. You can't do anything about that. If the Soviets, or now the Russians, they got a lot of oil. But as the Soviet, it was Soviet at that time, Russian geologist said, by the injustices of nature, they put the oil there far away from the population and industrial centers. It starts out in the Caucasus, and you have to go up the Volga, take the oil to the industrial region. Then you go to the Volga-Urals region. If you've ever been, I've only been there once. It's a lot of long distances in Russia. That's the closest they've ever been to having oil near population and industrial centers. And now their big production center for oil and natural gas is Western Siberia. Not Central Siberia or Eastern. How do you get to Western Siberia? You go out in the middle of nowhere and turn left. And the problem with Western Siberia is the rivers flow to the Arctic. So they freeze in the winter. But when they thaw from the south to the north, so it floods. So basically, the only time you can work there is in the winter when you can work on ice. And you get they used to pay people a hazardous pay or heavy duty pay once they got 40 below and the wind was over 40 miles an hour. Otherwise, it's normal weather. So yeah, so where it is important. When it happened is important. Things are all connected. I just was at a conference in Canada that co-organized with a colleague, and we called the conference Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. And it was talking about how the oil crisis led to changes in the financial system, rearranges geopolitics, it rearranges domestic relations in a lot of places. Now, obviously, I didn't come up. Fortunately, don't copyright titles, so we're okay, and we didn't make any money. I always tell my students, if you got into history to make a lot of money, you were misinformed. It's still a nice career. You were misinformed. Historians we love sources, like that we go to archives, which is boring, when we talk about where you've been. Well, I've been to Kew Gardens, and that's the British archives. I've been to the presidential libraries, most of which are interesting. Not all are in interesting places. But, sources, primary sources are important. And secondary sources are important. Historians like to know, well, what did somebody else written? What did they use for sources? Usually, if you hand a student, somebody a book, you can tell if a historian, they'll go to the back. They want to see the notes and the bibliography. They want to know, you can write bad books with good sources. Pretty hard to write good books with bad sources. But you also have to learn to evaluate sources. You have to learn to evaluate different opinions. I taught a course where we're teaching freshmen. So here's 2 articles on the Iranian crisis, 1951-54. One of them says this, one of them says that. And it's diametrically opposed. Who's right? Why? What are their sources? What are the premises? How do they analyze things? So it really helps you distinguish between evidence-based conclusions and unfounded statements. Sounds like what we do when we listen to well, this is democratic. We can say anything. And myth and reality, and how to support conclusions with evidence. Okay. Now, oil is fine, but it's almost a language. In the US, we talk about barrels of oil. Now, you've seen the big oil drums, right? That's 55 gallons. A barrel of oil as a measurement actually is 42 gallons. Why is it that small? When they first started producing oil in Pennsylvania, they needed something to transport in, and they needed big barrels, and then the people had big barrels were whiskey barrels, which were 42 gallons. So that's how we got the 42 gallons. So the US, we use barrels and barrels per day. The rest of the world use the metric ton, which is heavier than the US ton, spelled differently too. And that's also a problem, not just because we're using different units. One is a unit of volume and one is a unit of weight. So if you're doing, some countries, you do the charts on who's the biggest producer. They could be high up and be here in barrels and up here in weight because most of the oil is heavy oil. Oil comes in different grades. It can be heavy or light. It's better to be light. You can do more gasoline and high value products from it. Sweet and sour, whether it has lots of sulfur in it, which is bad. So, when you're reading, that can be barrels per day, tons per year. Proved reserves. How much oil is that how much oil is there? Nope. That's how much oil is there that can be produced given existing technology and current prices. Prices go up, proved reserves go up. Prices go down, proved reserve. So it's not a geological definition. It combines geology, economics, and technology. And one of the big things you probably remember a few years ago, people worried about running out of oil. The world's running out of oil. They didn't count on technology. And actually, the guy who came up with this was a bit of a nutcase, but he first predicted the U.S. production would peak in around 1970, and it did. And everybody said, "Well, the guy's a genius." He was right in terms of continental United States. Didn't include Alaska. His first prediction was in 1956. Alaska did not become a state till 1959. And this is before offshore. Used to be offshore was, you go out maybe 50 feet deep. They run piers out. Now they go in 15,000 feet deep, before they get to the seabed. And then they go after, start drilling through rock after that. So technology is very important. Crude oil versus liquid fuels. This is a little trick they've come up with. It used to be crude oil. This is oil out of the ground. Now they do liquid fuels, which includes natural gas liquids. And those are petroleum-like compounds that are in natural gas under pressure as gas, but when they come to the surface, they turn into liquid. Butane, propane, things like that. Now they add those in. So when you look at old statistics, they only talk about crude oil. The new statistics, they talk about that. Like the US now is like 12, 13 million barrels a day of crude oil, about 17 to 18 million barrels a day of petroleum liquids. You have to be careful. LNG, liquefied natural gas. That's when you take natural gas, freeze it, and reduce the volume by a factor of 600. So you can transport it. Natural gas, not worth much because most of the cost of natural gas is transporting it, either by pipeline. Basically, you're not going to get much in trucks. Pipeline is the main. Now you have liquefied natural gas, so you can put it in ships, specialty ships, which are huge and expensive. And you can transport it around the world. Before that, natural gas was in regional markets. You're not going to have a pipeline across the Atlantic or the Pacific. The Russians have some very long pipelines, but they're not that long. Shale oil versus oil shale. Shale oil is what we talk about with fracking. That's oil and gas in very tight formations. You break them up, hydraulic fracking usually. Though at one point they wanted to use atomic weapons. Nah, not a good one. That one didn't go anywhere, fortunately. Oil shale is shale that you mine, heat, and turn it into fuel. They did that in Scotland for many years. They did it in northern China and in Estonia. But so you need to, keep those in mind. Upstream, midstream, downstream, upstream producing, midstream transportation, downstream refining and selling, unless some places refining is done midstream. Countries or companies, national oil companies versus international oil companies versus independents. National oil company, Saudi Aramco, sorry about that, Saudi Aramco, very, that's the biggest. Rosneft, a Russian company. Most of these are a product of the 1970s, though Pemex in Mexico was formed in 1938. There's some other Latin American, Petrobras in Brazil, formed in 1953. For many years, it was the oil company without any oil. They didn't find any oil till the 1980s. Independents are companies just in one part of the business. They're not integrated in production, refining, marketing. Now with this audience, I can talk about a good example of independent oil company is Ewing Oil. From Dallas. You guys, none of my students remember any of this. Okay. The other one is OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, versus OAPEC, Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. The embargo and production cuts in 1973 were done by OAPEC, and that was a political move. The price increases were done by OPEC, taking advantage of the rise in prices that resulted from the production cuts and the embargo. There was no OPEC embargo. That's a trick question I got in trouble with once at an audience at a meeting. It says, how many people know when what year was the OPEC embargo? That's a trick question. And OPEC has tried to be a cartel. They have never really, maybe from 70 to 85, not really. But we still like to talk. They try. They don't control enough production. They don't have enough common interest. And the barriers to entry are low enough that if they get the price too high, other people will join, like I said, with proved reserves. So oil became a national security issue. Back in the 19th century, oil was for kerosene, for lighting. In the 1880s, 90s, electricity came in, the oil companies were in trouble. And somebody invented the internal combustion engine and the automobile, and they got a second life. But when it becomes a national security issue is when the navies of the world shift from coal to oil. You know, most of them used to have 2,000 tons of coal on the ship, with people with shovels tossing it in the furnace, boiling oil, running a steam turbine, or sometimes steam piston engines. Turbines were better. British were the first, even though they didn't have any oil, they had coal, but oil is 40% more energy content, much easier to transport, much easier to load. You don't have people shoveling oil in. You can run it on pipes. Most importantly, you can refuel at sea. You can't do that with coal power. So the British make the decision. Was a guy, sort of a short, chubby guy, cigar, was first, he's head of the Admiralty, first Navy Lord, and he makes the decision in 1913. The U.S. also, the U.S. makes the decision. And so by World War I, the British are building, the big decision is oil battleships. They'd already be using smaller with oil. Though this case, they're using oil, they just boil water, run steam turbine. But by the end of World War I, the British Navy is over half oil powered. And everybody by the 1920s begins to convert. I think the last coal powered warship was built in 1964 in Australia. Who would have thought? So that's when it becomes, and in World War I, oil didn't win World War I, but the military innovations of World War I were oil powered, especially submarines. I can't imagine a coal powered submarine. They did actually try that. Submarines, airplanes, though you didn't have many long range bombers. Airplanes in World War I were for reconnaissance to tell people where the artillery was. So you didn't, but that's when airplanes become important. Tanks become in, and then most importantly, trucks. because usually if you were moving lots of troops and equipment, you had to go where the railroad was. If you didn't have the railroad to the front, you had to try to build some small gauge tracks. Trucks can go for other places. Germans didn't have much in the way of oil. They also ran out of even lubricants. U.S. had plenty of oil once they figured out how to get the oil across the ocean without being sunk. Though if you've ever been in a World War I submarine or seen one, I've never been in a submarine by choice unless it's in a museum. World War I submarine is smaller than this one. Iron coffin. World War II are not a lot bigger, but they're much more effective. But so this, everybody becomes this. You have to have oil to have power, and this before World War II. You had 6 or 7 great powers. The problem is only 2 of them have any oil: the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, had just been through, let's see, 2 revolutions, a war, a civil war, and industrialization, great purchase. They weren't in great shape. The British, a big sea power, but they don't have oil. They have a big concession in Iran, but last time I checked, it's a long way from Iran to Britain, and they didn't have enough tankers. So basically, this is what puts Britain in the U.S. hands. They have to depend on the U.S. For oil. The Germans try to make oil out of coal. They make a lot of oil out of coal. It's not particularly good oil. They use it in their airplanes. The problem is there's huge plants. In World War II, planes, we had the bomb sight. Why did they bomb cities in World War II? Because you could hit a city. You basically cannot hit it. Even these huge, coal plants, 5% of the bombs dropped on them, landed inside the plant. But they dropped enough of them. Once, starting in about 44, when you got the long-range Mustangs, the bombers that began to bomb the oil, the coal plants, hydrogenation plants. And the Germans basically ran out of oil. They came up with a jet plane toward the end of the war. They had to tow it out. They had so little fuel, they would actually tow it out with oxen rather than, just, move out on its own power. They ran out of oil. The Japanese ran out of oil. The Japanese starts the war. Pearl Harbor attack was to cripple the U.S. Navy so they could take over Indonesia, which was then called the Netherlands East Indies, which has oil. The problem was they took it over. They started up the oil fields, and then we got to get that oil back to Japan. And U.S. had long-range submarines, and by the end of the war, nobody got through. One of the reasons for a kamikaze only has to go one way. You don't have to have enough fuel for the return flight. And the Japanese basically ran out of oil by the end of the war. So, in the post-war world, obviously the big military innovations of World War II include the atomic bomb, ballistic missiles, radar. None of these are oil powered, but all the weapon systems that we have today, except for submarines, some submarines, not all submarines, and aircraft carriers. They have a few cruisers, but all your planes are still petroleum powered. Most of your ships, all your armor. So oil is still very, very important. Now, wouldn't be too important if it was a global thermonuclear war, which, as one document said, smoking, radiating ruin in 2 to 3 hours. It's going to be a short war. Fortunately, we didn't have that. But as I said, the U.S. oil is not, the oil in the Middle East is not so much for the United States, which has plenty of oil. It's for rebuilding Europe and rebuilding Japan. And that's the Marshall Plan was very important in that it influences the Allies, it influences their choices. And this is the period after World War II where oil builds up. By 1950, oil becomes more important in the U.S. economy, and by the 60s is more important in Japanese and European economy. So it becomes important to economic life. And this makes access to oil an important issue of national security. So Global South, it used to be called the Third World. Some people thought that that was a negative term. It was actually meant to be a positive term, like the Third Estate and the French Revolution. But now people call it the Global South, even though it's not really south of the, most of it's not south of the equator. It's not a geographical term. These are some of the places where U.S. and British companies, and most of the companies were U.S. and British international companies. Shell is 60% Dutch, 40% British. CFP, I'm not going to even try to say that in French. My French, pretended to read French, not speak French. It's a French national company now. It's now Total. It's part of Total was the CFP. But most of these are U.S. companies. Mexico gets started during just on the eve of World War I. And there's a huge development. Mexico is the second leading producer in the world by the end of World War I. But it's a really destructive, 21, 29. I told Howard there would be a typo in there. That's supposed to be 1921. Oh, well, very environmentally destructive. They didn't know they would have explosions, fires, huge leaks, turn the rainforest into a desert, and the Mexicans had changed their law in the 1890s and said, oh, if foreign companies buy the land, they can have the subsoil rights. And so they weren't getting any money for the oil that's being produced. And 1917 Constitution says subsoil rights belong to the nation. And that sets up a little problem with companies that bought it the other way. So they had to do a compromise. If you bought the land and you produced oil before 1917, you get to keep it. If you bought the land and didn't produce, and you produce oil after, it's ours, and you have to pay for it. And if you buy the land after 1917, you have to pay, for subsoil rights. And this leads to problems. And then the nationalizations, the first major nationalization oil company in March 1938 used to be a holiday in Mexico. Venezuela replaces Mexican oil. Mexican oil began to decline in the 20s because they depleted the early fields, hadn't found any new ones. Shell actually finds a big field in 1932, just to loosen it in 1938. American companies didn't find any more, but they still opposed the nationalization. Venezuela becomes a major producer in the 1920s. By the 1930s, it's one of the leading exporters, and it's dominated by Standard Oil of New York, Shell, and Standard Oil of, and Gulf. So, and you have a whole history of coups, revolution in Mexico, same thing in Iran. The British dominated Iran until 1951. The Iranians nationalized in 51. Then the US and British overthrew the government in 1953 and put the Shah back in power, and that works till about 1978. Iraq was created after World War I. You had a multinational consortium running it. US, well, there's the companies, AOC, Shell, that's Anglo-Iranian, Shell, Sukhani, French company, Revolution 58, coups. We have Iraq that we have today. Saudi Arabia, Chevron found oil in 53, brought Texaco in 36 and discovered oil in 38. 1947, 48, Exxon and Mobil buy shares in Aramco. They were supposed to buy, it was going to be, let's see, it was going to be 30, 30, 20, 20, 30 for Chevron, 30 for Texaco, 30 for Exxon, and 30 for Mobil. Mobil got nervous and dropped theirs to 10, called the $1 billion blunder. And so, and Kuwait was oil, Anglo-Iranian and Gulf together. Gulf got in there. The British didn't want them in, but the U.S. Ambassador to Britain at this time was Andrew Mellon. Mellon's own Gulf Oil. Gulf got in, and basically they sold the oil to Shell because Shell had markets they didn't. And United Arab Emirates in 1953. And Dutch East Indies, sorry, keep moving away from the microphone. It's just a bad habit. It's basically dominated by Shell. It was a Dutch colony, Royal Dutch Shell. And you have a coup in 65, military rule-ins. Seven Sisters sort of ran things, the companies till the 70s. As I said, the Brazilian company, Petrobras, was in 53. You have a coup in 64. They didn't find oil to the 80s. Moving on quickly. This is when the oil was discovered in the various places in the Middle East. You can see the only one that actually produced a lot of oil before World War II was Iran. Fair amount came out of Iraq. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait find oil in 38. World War II comes on. They don't really start producing until afterwards. So Middle East really doesn't become a major factor until the 50s and 60s, really. Venezuela is a big factor. Moving on. There's the Seven Sisters, and little trip down nostalgia road here. With those, as I say, that's changed. No, it's good. Moving along. Control of oil was central to U.S. strategy in the Cold War. U.S. wants to end intercapitalist conflict. In other words, who fought against each other in World War II? Mostly capitalist countries, except for the Soviet Union. I once had a freshman at Georgetown raises her hand and says, Professor Painter, can you tell me who was on which side in World War II? And I said, yes, I can. She was a first semester freshman, and she just wanted to be sure. But this is a way, instead of the capitalist countries fighting each other, it becomes the capitalist versus the communist. And oil, we supply our guys with oil, so they don't have to fight each other for it. Pretty good idea. Mitigate class conflict by promoting economic growth. You had Great Depression, a lot of class conflict, and the way to economic growth and oil becomes very important to that. The Marshall Plan, one of its major expenditures, was giving European countries dollars to buy oil from American companies. The Marshall Plan was really about in the Middle East, because if they didn't, they would have bought it from British companies, and the U.S. companies would have lost their markets. They would have then they would have tried to export the oil to the U.S., and the people in Texas would have lost their minds, or whatever. Maintaining, okay, control, maintaining access to the reserves, oil reserves in the third world. I just went through the history of revolutions and coups. And this is a way to contain the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had a lot of oil, but they weren't in very good shape in 1945. And they actually are a net importer till the early 50s. They took it from Romania. And you know what other country they got a lot of oil from? Austria. They had a big occupation zone in Austria, and that's where the oil was. They had an occupation zone in Austria until 55. U.S. of course opposes economic nationalism, companies getting nationalized. That's one of the reasons they overthrew Mossadegh in 1953. In the 70s, the oil crisis interaction, in the 50s and 60s, there's more oil being produced and there's markets for it, so the price of oil goes down. Price of oil was $1.80 a barrel from about 1960 to 70. But the problem with that is when it's cheap, people want to produce in low-cost areas, and the low-cost areas are the Middle East and Venezuela, not in the U.S. So U.S. production peaks in 1970, and U.S. starts importing lots and lots of oil. So when the crisis hits, the U.S. is short Western Europe and Japan, even more dependent on oil. So that's why there's a crisis, when not because everybody said it's a good time to squeeze them, because there was a war. And that's because the Organization of Arab Petroleum Companies do the embargo and the production cuts. Then the OPEC and one of our allies, the Shah of Iran, who did not participate in the embargo. Iran's not an Arab country, but he wants higher prices because he wants to make Persia great again. I don't think he had any hats up, but so yeah, okay. And then there's a myth that the U.S., one of the ways the U.S. won the Cold War, it was we forced the price of oil down. We got the Saudis to up production, which makes prices crash in 1985, 1986. And by this time, oil is about the only thing the Soviets have to sell that people want to buy. And it does ruin their budget. And a lot of people said, well, we won it that way. That's not exactly what happened. The Saudis were cutting production to keep prices up from 1980 till 85, and they weren't getting anywhere. They were just dropping their production, losing money, and everybody else was selling oil, taking advantage of them. And then 1985, they changed their mind. So that was the oil in the Cold War moving quickly. There's all the different coups that are related to oil, with the Suez Crisis, Suez Canal. There's not much oil at that time in Egypt. Egypt's now a decent mid-sized producer. Most of the oil from the Middle East that went to Western Europe went through the Suez Canal. So when you have the crisis, the Egyptians block the Suez Canal, and that allows the U.S. to squeeze the British and the French, who had the Suez Crisis. Anybody, you guys remember the Suez Crisis? This was the dumbest thing anybody ever came up with. The British and French and Israeli plan, they denied it for years, and then the British had the documents, and the French kept documents, and the Israelis kept documents. And Anthony Eden writes his memoirs, denies everything, and then the documents get published. So Iraq, there's a revolution in 58, overthrows the monarchy. And then there's a coups in 63 and 68. And that's when Saddam Hussein and his guys get in. Though he's not officially ruler till 79. 6-Day War. One of the precipitating factors was that the Egyptians said they were going to block Israeli access to the Straits of Tiran, which is the main way the Israelis imported oil. They come down the Red Sea, hang a right before the Suez Canal, and go up that way. Obviously, in the 1970s, price of oil goes from $1.80. September it was $3. In January 74, it's $11.65. Goes up a lot in a short time. And then in the 70s, the British were maintaining Western position in the Middle East. They decided they can't afford it. And who's going to take it over? Well, the U.S. is in the Vietnam War. So the Shah says, I'll do it. Unfortunately for the Shah, that did not work out. He spent all of his oil money on weapons, and you have a revolution, and you end up with the Carter Doctrine, where the U.S. says, we'll use military force to maintain Western access to Middle East oil. And that's still policy today. Price shock, it doesn't look as big, but it is in actual dollar terms. We don't, it's actually, in dollar terms, it's bigger. Iran-Iraq war, the Iraqis try to go into southern Iraq where the oil is. And that whole war is financed by both sides by oil exports. So that's when you have the tanker war, sinking each other's tankers so they can't buy more weapons. And then the Iraqis end up with the war owing a lot of money to a lot of people in the Middle East, especially the Kuwaitis. And the Kuwaitis say, where's my money? And Saddam says, here's my tanks. This is the last Cold War conflict. It's the last conflict of the Cold War. It's the first conflict of the post-Cold War, sort of a hinge point. So since 1990, there's two parts. And, until U.S. oil production declines from 1970 to 2007. And so this is a period from about 1970 to 2010 where U.S. is actually dependent heavily on oil imports. Shale boom cuts in, technology of offshore production, things like that. But Persian Gulf security and stability to be a key focus of U.S. foreign policy since World War II. Carter Doctrine says we'll even use force. We've had 2 wars with Iraq, still continued tensions with Iran, and close ties with the Saudis and other Gulf states. And this was, worrying about U.S., our allies in Asia and Europe being dependent on Middle East oil and Russian oil and Russian gas. Oil is a big part of what they call the renewed great power conflict with China, because Chinese oil history is interesting. They couldn't find any until 1959. The Russians actually helped them find the oil. And what also happens in 1959 and 1960? Sino-Soviet split. And the Russian says, well, we're not going to help you anymore. And the Chinese says, that's fine. We have now the Daqing oil field. And just in time. And they were the largest field till the 1990s, but since about 93, Chinese become a major oil importer. So, and what they worry about, SLOC, sea line of communication. In other words, how's the oil going to get there? And has to go through the main choke point besides the Straits of Hormuz, which is in the Persian Gulf, is the Straits of Malacca. And so that's why the Chinese are so concerned about dominating the South China Sea. That's why they're trying to build some pipelines cutting across from Iran, into Western China. And they're very worried about U.S. using economic sanctions as an instrument of punishment. The Chinese still have a lot of oil, but they still import so much more because the tremendous growth in the Chinese economy from the 1990s, especially after 2000. So that's the thing. Of course, the other one here is environmental impact, pollution, oil spills. Remember Deepwater Horizon, Exxon Valdez, climate change, climate denial. I thought, given the group, we talk about the elephant in the room, a big orange elephant in the room who's talking about climate change as a hoax, I believe, was the latest. I don't know if it was very good. I think 2 days ago, the Times had a very good set of charts on higher and higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is not the only problem. Methane is even more powerful in the short run. And there's a lot of other ways it causes problems. The pollution and oil spills being one. There's also the problem of the whole so-called resource curse. Countries dependent on these revenues. It's a way you can have an autocratic government because you don't have to tax. If you have to tax the people, you either have to be able to coerce them or convince them to pay their taxes. And if you don't have to get popular consent, you just pay your military and you can coerce it. So, there's very few countries that have been major producers that have had democratic governments. I mean, the classic studies on Venezuela, which grew into a modern state at the same time it had oil, and how that affected the institutions of the state. But that's a problem, the resource scourge. And then this one, last one, they don't talk about much in the US. In Europe, this is big: energy poverty. Lots of countries need to use more energy and more oil. The problem is we don't need to put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So if we're going to get both, somebody has to go down. And if you do, US is the major producer, China's big. Do it on per capita oil use and energy use. Probably, I think the most energy per capita is Qatar. I don't know if you've ever been to Qatar. There's not a lot there. I mean, in terms of natural resource, not a lot of forest and fields and things, and a lot of air conditioning. Qatar is a major, the Gulf states. Canada, it's cold. Just in Canada, Calgary, just the week before I got there, it was 35 below. It was only 5 below when I was there. River was frozen. But the U.S. uses a lot. China uses a lot of oil per capita. There's a lot of, once you start dividing the numbers, it's not anywhere near as large. The other major, I used to have my students do tables. What are the top 7 producing countries over time? That just moves the top 3 pretty much stay the same: US, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Soviet Union. Yeah, the others move around, mostly Middle East. Venezuela goes up and down. Mexico comes in and goes out. Brazil suddenly appears. Consumption is different. You do your top 7 in 1950, Sweden's in there. In places like now, the top is US, next China. Who thinks next? India. Japan, it used to be US, Russia, Soviet Union, US, Soviet Union, Japan, Germany. The other problem with statistics is the main statistics you use were put out by BP. Now it's called the Energy Institute puts them out. And they do Germany, and it's not clear whether Germany, there used to be more than one, right? And they're not clear on that one. When they do Germany, are they doing East and West together before 1990? But when you do statistics and tables, that causes problems. So you have to do a lot of back and forth adding. So there's a great source, Energy Information Agency, EIA. I worked for 18 months at Department of Energy. I was a contract employee, spanned the Carter administration and the Reagan administration. I was in Solar and Conservation Division. We were big till about January 1981. And then, as they say, the technical term, we were zeroed out when I left in August 81 and finished my dissertation. Thank you. That's the only thing I can think of right now that I can thank Ronald Reagan for. I could probably come up with something else, but look at there's your top 3. And this is using just crude oil and condensate. This is what's traditionally used. If you use, like, the US is now doing about 13 million, I think in 2023 it was about 13 million barrels a day. So next one, I got to learn to do this better with Excel. But give me the next slide. Making hydrothermal electrons. Yeah, you can always see how the pie cells. I'm almost there. Yeah.
So why are gas prices?
They're not in historical terms. Yeah, in historical terms, if you did real prices, they're not particularly high. They're a lot less than almost anywhere else in the world. Yeah. Well, the problem was we built our infrastructure. The infrastructure we're living with today was started in the 1920s and 30s when we had lots of oil and low prices. And, it's still fairly low, all things considered. The nice thing, give me the next, I think the next slide. That one has, the other thing is there's usually a year or 2 lag in your statistics. And you can see the real price and the nominal price. So today, can I just, take a while, I love to have to go put it down. There we go. Let's see here. What are we talking about? This is barrels. So you can see that it really went up. You remember 2008, how expensive oil really went up? Actually, that was a good year. I was in Norway and on the fellowship and getting paid in krona. Oh, man, that was a good year. But then the next year I was supposed to go to Ireland and didn't do that one. But that's how you do that. So that's to show you the difference. I can remember when I was growing up, maybe 31 cents a gallon. Of course, 31 cents a gallon. I don't let's see, in 1967, it's probably a factor of 10, probably from the 60s to today. I did it once when I was a student at work study. It was $1.25 an hour, and that's probably over $10 an hour today. So it's all relative. I think just one more thing, and a couple more. Okay, this is how you can do. You can see there was a time when the U.S. we were importing, producing a lot less than we were consuming. Those minus 2022. We were now sort of a net exporter. It's not really clear because you have to get it in for refineries. Okay, next couple, just did one. This is future proved reserves. Go back on one, you can see who dominates. Now, the problem was the 2 and 3 are little fuzzy. Venezuela is heavy oil, most of that, which is very difficult to produce and very expensive. And Canada is what I call tar sands. When you're in Canada, you say oil sands. But you can see most of that is in the Middle East. OPEC is a good bit of the world. Those are in billions, so that the world is trillions. But you look at Russia, look at the US, China, European Union, not a lot of oil. This is the future. But, you know, it's not clear how much oil there's going to be given prices and technology. So the last couple of slides are going to be US is leading, natural gas is big, coal. I thought coal was being phased out in the 70s. It made a comeback, and coal has done well. Natural gas, now that we have liquefied, electrification. Electricity is not an energy source. It's a form of transfer, so you have to produce it somewhere. And a lot of it in the world is being produced by coal. Nuclear power has never made it. Hydro sort of stagnated. Renewables are doing well, but still very small. Go to the next one. And there's you can see coal from 1950 to 2022. Big drop after 1960. Oil goes up, sort of leveled out. Natural gas makes a nice thing. Fossil fuels are we still dependent on them. Let's see. Most of the world says nuclear, 2 syllables. Down here, we say nuclear with 3 syllables, or I do. Hydro, as you can see, renewables have gone up. This is in percentages. They won't get into how do you do them. You have to convert them into heat content. Next, yeah, go back. If you want to study the politics of oil, that's a famous book by Robert Engler. It's outdated, but his analysis is good. Stephen Luke's is very good. I think it's in its 4th edition. This book called Power, and it's short, mercifully short. William Collins. But basically, private companies still control the resources. They have the technology, the finance, the management skills. And that gives them a lot of power. They control investment decisions. And most of, and then certainly in the United States, maybe not the rest of the world. So that means they can influence policies, they can set agendas, and then they do a lot of just influence and attitude. That's the 3 faces of power, according to Luke's. And it's all about who defines. So that's how to learn from history. It's a window into US foreign policy. You look at its strategic economic importance, you look at uneven distribution, the balance of power, international inequality, conflict, and technology changing over time. You have to look at the demand side as well as the supply side. And then, of course, the environmental impact is very important. My take is that what we should be focusing on is not how to get more oil and more energy, but how do we get out of the mess we put ourselves in? It's an unsustainable and destructive economic model. The next 2 slides are just, there's an article I wrote, sort of summarizes the talk. This is a recent book, pretty good. I don't know if anybody here read The Prize by Daniel Yergin. That's a great book. It's also, you can get it, there's an 8-part video. I'm in number 5. That's back when my hair was red. My student says, "Who is that?" That was me a long time ago. But those are the best. And those are, if you want to look up sources of energy, like statistics, EIA is really good. Energy Institute, Statistical Review, if you like to look at Excel tables. Columbia University has a Center of Energy Policy. International Energy Agency puts out a lot of studies. Most of them they charge you for. EIA is free. That's a big difference. There's a guy, Reuters, who does a column that's really good. There's some NGOs. This is a nice little pamphlet put out many years ago, and it has a lot of people summarizing long books and short articles, and it's online. And then the main guy who does stuff on energy is Václav Smil, is originally from Czech, I guess it's Czechoslovakia when he was there. He writes too many books, maybe every other year. This is one of the better ones. It's a short book about energy in general. He's got one on oil. It's not quite as good. The problem, his English is still not good. I don't know if you've heard a Czech once explained to me why there's so many consonants in Czech. I've ever written. And he says, you have to remember we were once a poor country and we couldn't afford vowels, which is a nice play on what is this? Wheel of Fortune, right? Or it's that we couldn't afford many vowels. So sorry, I went over on the time. Too many stories.
If we have time for one or two questions, so can I wait for the microphone?
She's got the one. Sorry about that.
I was going to ask about Africa, and I spent a summer in college in Nigeria, and Nigeria oil wells and the disasters that were happening to the Nigerian people because of the oil.
Yeah, Nigeria's with the Niger Delta. That was a big factor in the Civil War from 1967 to 70. A lot of the companies are getting out of onshore Nigeria and moving offshore. A lot of the West African oil is now being found offshore. And that's really the same field that where the Brazilians are finding on the underside of the Great Atlantic Rift. One time, all that was many years ago, was more or less together. Yeah, Nigeria is the major producer out. Angola produces a bit. What's the other place? Guinea. Yeah, Nigeria would be a case study of the oil curse, that they get all this money and they lose it through corruption. It doesn't get. That's part of the problem, though. The money goes to the central government. It doesn't stay in the part of the country, which the other people say, hey, it's part of the country, we should have some of that. Well, so yeah, but Africa, really, they didn't find oil in Nigeria to 56. They almost found oil in 1912. They stopped about 50 miles south of where a little bit deeper. That might have changed things a little bit geopolitically, because it's a British colony and it's a lot closer. Most African oil today either goes to Western Europe or to the US. It's still not a major factor. I guess the continent most dependent on oil is Asia. There's not a lot of production in most of Asia, and there's a lot of economic growth, a lot of consumption. So, I mean, that's another way you can divide things up. I mean, the Chinese have 3 big oil companies, semi-state, semi-private. Japanese have to import most of their oil. Koreans. Australia is now a major producer and a major factor in natural gas, with liquefied natural gas.
Question.
Yeah, I lived and taught in the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi for about 7 years. And when we were leaving in 2017, there was a bit of a recession. But we noticed that the Americans were leaving and they were being replaced by Chinese. And we'd ask people, they said, you want to know who won the Iraq war? It was the Chinese. Do you have a sense that China is replacing the US in that region, at least in extent at all?
I think they're replacing, they're trying to get a position because they import a lot of their oil from that region. They need it a lot more than we don't need the oil from there. Europe has transitioned away from oil. You also have the North Sea that came in the 70s. And then Europe is doing a lot with natural gas. So, Latin America doesn't need the Middle East oil anymore because Brazil is now a major producer. Guyana is now a major producer. So you've had sort of a reshuffling starting with the high prices of the 70s and 80s and then going into the 80s of the flows of oil. Russia becomes a major supplier. Now, most of the Russian oil goes to India and other places. At lower prices, but there's, the US is trying to sanction that. But I don't know if the Chinese, I've seen Abu Dhabi, what's it, National Oil Company.
Yeah.
They're UAE. I mean, the problem, I guess, is that most of the oil is produced in Abu Dhabi and most of the money is in Dubai. They don't have the oil, they have the money, the banks, the airline. Yeah, they're doing pretty well. Qatar is mostly natural gas. They share a big gas field across the Gulf with Iran. Iran is a major gas producer. Problem with gas is pipelines are expensive and dangerous. You mean they're easy to blow up and rebuild them. Liquefied natural gas, Qatar's a big player. Australia's become a big player, and US is a big player. I mean, one of the reasons US can really has not been as bothered so much about the Russians' invasion of Iraq and the sanctions and not getting natural gas and not getting oil is the Europeans have to import natural gas from us now, because we've got more than we need due to fracking. And we can get oil, we can export some oil. So yeah, it's not the only factor. It's something that a lot of people don't take into account when they talk about international. You have to take it into account. I always go back to the 70s. What was it Deep Throat said? Follow the money. Follow the money. And oil is as good as money.
Some people are wanting to stop and some people are wanting to stay. So he will stay, and anybody who wants to ask questions will be here till midnight.
Thank you.
Sorry. Did you want to say something?
I was just gonna say, too much stuff. I mean, a lot of information.
Yeah.
But, yes. If 10% of it sticks, it's more than I had before.
That's right.
Yeah. So if you can